Good morning. How's everybody? Turn your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Do we have any announcements that we need to make that are not on the announcement sheet? All right. You know, people can say things about you, and it doesn't have to be true. Sometimes they do that to hurt you. Sometimes they do it to hurt your influence. Sometimes they do it because they perceive what they're saying is true. May not necessarily be true, but they perceive it or they understood it that way. And we call that slander. And we face it from time to time. Paul faced it. And he's facing it throughout this whole book of 2 Corinthians. One of the things that we have today is, of course, computer, the internet, all the social medias of today, in which folks can sit at home in the privacy of their own home without really anyone, taking anything and saying anything about them. And they can criticize and they can talk about you. And you may know it and you may never know it. You're not connected in. You may never know it. But you may know it. And then if you reply, they can just turn you off or go into another room and leave their computer on as if it was there. Paul didn't have a computer in his day, but he had people that talked. So slander is not new today. It's always been, and I suppose will always be. What Paul is going to talk about, as he's talked about throughout this whole book, the defense of himself. Paul's going to talk about himself again in this 10th chapter. He comes back to it. If you recall last week, we talked in the 8th and 9th chapter, we talked about giving, but we also talked about Paul's defense of himself and how the distribution of that money would be handled. Now in the 10th chapter, he's going to talk about his own authority. He's going to talk about warring, a good warfare, and really, as we talk about these verses, we find out that Paul is setting a parameter for authority, but Paul is also showing really what type of man he was, what type of man of God, person of God, we should be. Let's look at it. Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who is in the presence and lowly among you, but being absent and bold towards you. Paul says, I'm pleading. I'm pleading with meekness, humbleness, if you will, gentleness. It's the idea of being free from anger. He's not upset. He's not bitter. He's just pleading his case. And it is interesting how he pleads his case if you stop and think about it. He'll occasionally point towards the fact that here's something that's said. Doesn't say who. He just says, here's something that's said, but this is the truth. But he says, I'm talking to you, I'm pleading to you, and I'm not bitter, I'm not upset. I'm just humble, I'm gentle. And notice what he says, I'm gentle and gentleness. It's the idea of kindness. So my response is not out of, I'm going to get you, I'm going to get even with you, I'm going to get back at you. I'm going to make sure that everybody understands where I stand and where they stand. And I'm going to make sure that I get my due in. That's not what he's saying. I'm responding with gentleness and meekness. He says, but being absent, I'm bold toward you. I'm not there, but I'm going to speak my piece. And there is a way to defend yourself against slanderers. We preachers talk about it every once in a while. because we're like everybody else. Folks slander us. How do you handle it? Some folks say nothing. Some try to defend a little bit, and some, really go full bore. But the attitude that Paul has, I think, is interesting. He says, okay, I'm coming at you. I'm going to be a little bold, but at the same time, too, I'm coming in meekness and gentleness. But I beg you that when I'm present, I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intended to be bold against some who think of us as if we walk according to the flesh. Paul says, when I come, I don't want to be bold. In other words, I think there's a couple of ways to look at this verse personally. I think the first way to look at it, and the way that I prefer to look at it, is this. This letter ought to straighten you out, so that when I come, I don't have to go back over all of this. I don't have to do this again. I think that's one way of looking at this verse. I think another way of looking at it is he says that I beg you that when I am present, I may not be bold. Maybe he wasn't as straightforward in his presence as he would have been sitting at his own place writing. Now, I don't like that way of looking at it personally, but there are some that look at it that way. I think he's simply saying, I think this letter needs to straighten you out. How many times do you need to be told how to do, what to do, when to do, until you do it? Well, as a kid, that was several times, right? But as an adult, just one time. And especially if and I think Paul's going to establish this later on in this chapter, if this is from God, that's enough. This has been, I'd have to stop and think. This has been 30 years ago. Yeah, almost 30 years ago. I was talking to a preacher that had been in the congregation for almost 30 years, I think. And he was talking about how things had changed. We were talking, and it was a fascinating discussion. But he said, when I first came to this congregation, he said, I could stand up and I could stand in the pulpit and I could preach a sermon. And he said, whatever I preached on, he said, I could tell. He said, I knew the people that it hit, and I could tell. And he said, there was immediate change. He says, 30 years later, I can know what's going on. I can preach a sermon on it, and nothing happens. And he said, I can preach several sermons on it, and nothing happens. Well, why is that? I don't know. I have some ideas, but I don't know. Paul says, change. He says, when I come, I want to have confidence. I want you to know something. Notice what he says in the last part of verse 2. He says, there's some who think of us as we walked according to the flesh. In other words, what I'm telling you is it came out of my head. It came from my own thinking. It came from the things of this world, not of God. For though we, verse 3, walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. Our fight's not a physical fight. Paul's not going to draw, have a showdown at midnight or 6 a.m. Paul says our fight's not a fleshly fight. Well, if it's not a fleshly fight, then what is it? For he says the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, fleshly. The sword, the spirit, the sword, the spears, the shields, the things of that nature. But mighty in God for the pulling down strongholds. The word strongholds is the idea of, the Greek word is the idea of forts, fortifications. He says, we're fighting a spiritual warfare, not a physical war. And the weapons are not swords, they're not spears, they're not shields, they're not armor. Well, what is it? If they're not carnal, well, they're spiritual things. Love, kindness, faith, those things. Casting down, the idea of casting down is the idea of destroying, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Paul says we're casting down, we're destroying. Well, what are we destroying? Well, think about what he says. Arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. So anything, philosophy, science, religions, that he says exalts itself against the knowledge of God. If folks are honest, and if folks listen, the truth will always quiet that which is not true. Now, that's true in anything, but especially with regards to God's truth. And if folks are honest in their listening, if folks are honest in their hearts and honest in their self-evaluation and honest in what they're being told, they ultimately come away or have to come away and say, there's something there. I was wrong. The debates of the 50s and 60s and early 70s were not always good. Oh, it brought, our points to the forefront. And so it was good to get those out and get folks to see the light. But most folks went to those debates, and most folks read those debates with a mindset. And they read it and saw it and listened to it as their side. Yes, this is right, this is right, this is right, this is right. And the other side, we don't know what he's talking about because he didn't know what he's talking about. And sometimes, most of the time, they got ugly, both sides. Paul says here, look, you need to know this is not about the flesh. This is about things with regards to God. There are those, though, that through their own thoughts, their own philosophies, their own ideas, have tried to bring the Lord down. But he says, we destroy those arguments, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience, some say, to the salvation of Christ. Speculations and traditions often outweigh truth. There's nothing wrong with traditions. Matter of fact, Paul talks about hold fast the traditions that you've been taught. And it's interesting because he told a preacher that. 2 Thessalonians 2, he's telling the church that as well. When you think about traditions, we hold to them. We want certain things done certain ways, and they've always been that way. We do that in families. I think I've shared with you the fact that we have, since Ethan was little bitty, on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, Suzanne and Ethan and I have always had a country ham breakfast. And one Christmas, I had a package of ham left over, and so I started sometime in January. Suzanne said, we're going to have breakfast, and I said, I'm going to cook the ham. Suzanne said, fine. So I cooked it, and Ethan said, what are we having? We told him. He threw a fit. Country ham was saved for Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. He's learned different. Traditions are fine. We have traditions. But in our own faith, if you will, our traditions, once changed, are changed with a lot of announcements and a lot of discussion and a lot of folks upset. At a congregation that I was at the time, it was decided because the way the pulpit looked and also and the repair which it needed, and the repair which the Lord's Supper table needed. It was decided. We had a professional painter in our congregation. We talked to him. He told us how he would fix it, and then he would paint it. And the elders, I was in the meeting, decided for it to be painted. We didn't ask anybody. We had had 2 or 3 complaints because they looked bad. And so we had it painted. Looked nice. Showed up great in the auditorium. Do you know we had a few people complain? Lord's Supper table's not supposed to be white. And where did you get that? First Opinions 9:7. Yeah, well, that's not Bible. And we've made it look better and hopefully last longer. And it sure was, I don't know how much we had to pay him because we had several other things done at the time, but it saved us a whole lot of money. Tradition. In 2 or 3's mind, matter of fact, he was a deacon. He said, Lord's Supper table's not supposed to be white. I said, and this was a guy that was trained to be a preacher, but he had gone into another field. Where did you get that? Well, Paul was trying to battle traditions, things that are speculations. And he says, we're going to cast all those things down. We're going to let the truth speak for itself, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. We're going to cast down all the imaginations. We're going to be ready to punish. Notice what he says, not just some disobedience. We're going to be ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. Anything in that, Paul's just basically setting out what's fixing. I understand. Y'all have to bear with me. Fixing to discuss in the rest of the chapter. Anything else? This book would have been about 22 to 25 years after his conversion.
Yeah. Imagine that there's still those people.
Oh, absolutely.
Don't you imagine that his political prowess had been attacked from both sides?
Yes. Yes.
I think of what goes on today. Some people call it alternative thinking. What it is in reality is negative research.
It's true.
And when you look at it from that perspective, it gives it a little bit different meaning to me.
Sure. Sure.
Paul is fighting a battle that in many social circles, he ain't going to.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And allowing him to present his ideas positive slant their city cause it pretty big wise.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. There's always a murmur of your past. Unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah. And I may have not said that. I know what I'm thinking, but I may not have said it right. But yeah, there's always, something in your past that you've done that, you were sorry for, you repented of, all the right steps. You've long since passed on, moved on from it, but there's still somebody that remembers it and somebody that is digging it up. You don't believe that? Just keep watching TV. There's enough political ads right now. They're digging up stuff that's folks running, Yeah, I agree.
There is a company that is exclusive digging up dirt day and age, representing
Yeah.
doesn't have to be true.
It's sort of like the National Enquirer. You remember that? It's not as famous anymore, but there were people all over. I read some research done one time. There were folks in Oklahoma writing stories about people in Los Angeles that they'd never seen before. They went, King Charles went out with whoever. And so, yeah, it happens. Yeah, doesn't have to be true. Anything else? Good point. Anything else? Well, Paul's going to talk about his authority. But in many ways, and I kind of like the way, I like the title that Wendell Winkler in a little book on 2 Corinthians gave it. He called it How to Recognize a Man of God. That's a pretty good little description of what's going to follow. But Paul's going to talk about compassion and courage and competence and caution. But it's interesting because he begins with an imperative. He begins with command. Do you look at things according to the outward appearance? And so, you see, here's a question. If anyone's convinced in himself that he is Christ, let him again consider this in himself, that just as he is Christ, even so we are Christ. That's one of those sentences that Paul just kind of goes around the loop and you go, what in the world? Paul was highly educated for his time, but also Paul seemed to get lost, for me at least, in his own jargon. But look what he says. He asks this question. You look at things according to the outward appearance. In other words, what are you looking at? It reminds us, or it reminds me when I read that question, it reminds me of, remember in the book of 1 Samuel, where Saul had been made king because that's what the people wanted. And then Saul disobeyed God, just displeased God, and God wanted a second king. And so David was found. But do you remember the search for David when Samuel comes to the house of Jesse? The runt of the litter is who's chosen, right? And remember, while he questions God, God reminds him not to look on the outward appearance, but to look where? On the heart. Well, that's, I think, at least when I read this question, I think of that. If anyone is convinced in himself that he's Christ, let him again consider this in himself, that just as he is, Christ is also. In other words, you got to be like Jesus. Now that's a key. Somebody reminded me recently in a workshop I was listening to talk and of a good point that I want to probably preach on here before the end of the year, where he talks about that as he is, so are we, in 1 John 3, verse 4, about Jesus. As Jesus was, we're to be. And that's the whole idea. Well, that's really what I think Paul is saying here. He says, if you say you're with Christ, then you'd be like Jesus. For even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification and not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed. Paul said, notice what he says. He says, if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which God gave us. Now, how do you look at boasting? How do you look at an individual's statements? Those of us that were here Wednesday night, the last 2-3 Wednesday nights, we've we're in Haggai and Zechariah. And one of the things that we noticed, especially in the book of Haggai, but also in Zechariah as well, because it starts out this way, that the prophet there, especially in Haggai, some 22 times makes the statement, thus says the Lord said. In other words, this is from God. Now, Paul says the authority that I've been given, it's been given to me from the Lord. And he says, may boast about that. Well, how do you look at boasting, as we said? Because if Paul just simply makes a statement, this is from the Lord, there's some that may consider that boasting. Why? Because he's saying, I've got a direct line with the Lord. And some would take that in a negative connotation or a negative light. And Paul says, notice that the Lord has given it to us, but notice that he says he has given it to us for edification, for building up, and not to tear you down. Paul says, God has given it to me to help you. Think about Paul's question, which he says to the church of Philippi. He says, am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Do you shoot the messenger, or is it the message that you should look at? Now that's, to me, as I read this, that's what Paul is saying. My focus is on trying to build you up from what the Lord has given to you. What the Lord's given it to me, and I'm passing it on. But now, do you shoot the messenger for the message? It's a great question to think about. He says, what I do for your edification. Verse 9, lest I seem to terrify you by letters. Evidently, some had, remember, we made the statement that Paul may have sent as many as 4 letters. He at least sent 3, but may have sent as many as 4 letters to the church of Corinth. We definitely have 2 of them. Now, some have said that third one, that sorrowful letter, is part of this last section, 10, 11, 12, and 13, chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13. More than likely not. More than likely, Paul at least wrote 3 letters. We don't have the sorrowful letter that he talked about earlier on in this book. And possibly there's another letter that we talked about, 5th chapter, 6th chapter in there, that may be a 4th one. We don't have it as well. But Paul says, maybe those things, and maybe that sorrowful letter where he made them sorry, he said, maybe it terrified you. But I just meant to edify you, meant to build you up, meant to make you to go in the right path. For, verse 10, his letters, they say, now this is a quote from others, for his letters are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Now, tradition, and that's all we have because Kodak had not made cameras yet. Tradition of Paul is that he was short, he was bow-legged, his eyesight was poor, he had a hooked nose, he was just not something that was appealing physically. Now that's tradition. Whether it's right or wrong, don't know. Seems to be. There's some credible sources of ancient past, but you still have to take it for what it is. From a physical standpoint, he ain't much. You ever thought about, go back and read the book of Jeremiah, you ever thought about his appearance? He came in old clothes. Well, don't know the clothes of Paul, but Paul's appearance, some will say, he's weak in appearance, but boy, he that pen of his, it's powerful, it's potent. It's ugly at times. That was their argument. Then he says, let such a person consider this, that we are in word by letters when we are absent, such as we also be indeed when we are present. Paul says, make sure that you understand that this letter that I've written to you in the past, and this one that I'm writing to you, that it's from God, first of all, because he says a couple of verses earlier, remember he said it's given to us by God, but he says, understand something, that the words that I write are as powerful as the words that I have when I'm there. And so there's a sense of courage that Paul is standing with, authority. Listen to what I'm telling you. Give heed to what's being said. Follow the truth. Follow the gospel. Follow God's word. And then he's going to say, but there are limits on it. We begin verse 12. Something about that paragraph. So if you think about it, there's a certain amount of compassion Paul has in this paragraph, verses 7 through 11. There's also a sense of courage, but there's also going to be some competence, but now competence and caution. For we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves, but they measuring themselves by themselves, comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. Think about what he says. We dare not compare ourselves with those who commend or stand with themselves. The word commend there is the idea of standing with. What do you measure with? What do you measure with? There's an old story, preacher story. Little boy comes in and tells his mama, he says, I'm 8 feet tall. And she says, you're 8 feet tall. He's like, 10-year-old, maybe a little less. Yeah, I'm 8 feet tall. How do you figure that? Well, he figured out how high he was, and he'd taken a shoe, and he said, that's 8 feet. Oh. What do you measure yourself by? Some measure themselves by other people, other individuals. Some folks measure themselves by what's going on out in the world. I'm not as bad as so-and-so. Some folks measure themselves by God. And that's what Paul is saying here. We're not comparing ourselves with those that are standing with themselves, commending themselves, because they are really measuring themselves compared to themselves. In other words, it's sort of a year to year. Let me compare myself this year to what was last year. Well, that in the comparison of year to year, you show growth, hopefully. But Paul says they're measuring themselves by themselves. And ultimately, what happens when you measure yourself by yourself, you've made yourself God. You've made yourself the final authority. You've made yourself the one that sets the limits. And ultimately, when we do that, we really don't improve. And we rarely change. So Paul says, we, verse 13, however, will not boast beyond measure, but within the limits of the sphere which God has appointed us, a sphere which especially includes you. God has limits. Those that have opposed Paul have set their own limits. Their limits are themselves. They're not willing to listen. They're not willing to hear. They're not willing to give heed. And Paul is doing what, as we said a while ago, when talking about some of the minor prophets, Paul is simply saying, this is what God said. And you're not listening. You've set yourself up. You've set yourself up as God. You've set yourself up as the final authority. But we need you to know that you need to set yourself up within the limits or the sphere of God, which we want to include you in as well. For, verse 14, we are not overextending ourselves as though our authority did not extend to you. For it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ. Paul says, you're in this circle. This was not, God didn't just put this on me for me. This is for all of us. This is not just for me. This is not just against me. This is for me. This is for you. This is for everyone. He says, we haven't overextended ourselves. He said, our authority did extend to you. The little paragraph, the little parentheses there, and he says, as though our authority did not extend to you. It extended to everybody. It's always interesting, and maybe you wouldn't find it as interesting as I, and that's fine, but to read religious writings of various things. To find not necessarily the differences, but just in reading them to see the differences. I have in my library quite a few books, a lot of books, but I have quite a few books that I don't agree with. But it's always interesting because there's some areas where I will agree with them, but it's always fun because you learn. If you keep reading things and people like you believe, you never grow. I believe. But it's always interesting to read folks that will talk about how that you sin, even as a child of God, as a Christian, but you don't fall away from the will of God. That they don't believe in the possibility of apostasy. Let's just put it that way. They don't believe in the fact that you can fall from the grace of God. That once you're saved, you're always saved, no matter what you do, no matter what you do. And they'll sit there and they'll quote a verse and they'll look at it and they'll even exegete it or explain it correctly. But then they set out to twist it, to change, to fit their overriding thought or philosophy, tradition, whatever you want to call it. Paul says, you need to know something. We haven't done that. We haven't overextended ourselves, but we have extended this to you, for it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ. Now, I want you to think about something. In 1 Corinthians 15, we studied that back last year, first this year. 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul made the statement about the gospel, remember he said that the gospel was the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he says in verse 1 and 2, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you have received, and wherein you stand, if, conditional, you keep in memory what I've preached unto you, unless you have believed in vain. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says, you've been taught the gospel, you've heard it, you've received the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now he says, you need to know that the gospel came to you as well. But think about where it came from. Paul was not the only teacher. Remember 1 Corinthians 3, Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. The idea that, we build upon each other. Paul was not the only preacher, but Paul was one of the first to come. and spread the gospel amongst the people. He says, not boasting of things beyond our measure, that is, in other men's labors, but having hope that as your faith is increased, we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our sphere. What do you think about old Paul? I mean, that's what he's saying. He says, we hope that you would think highly, or at least respect us for what we've done, what we've tried to do, for our role in teaching you the gospel, that as your faith increased, we shall be greatly enlarged by you in your sphere. Well, you may not agree with him on every point. You may not like everything. You may not like him, may not like his appearance, may not like sometimes the truth that he tells you, but there's a respect for the role. I was just thinking really yesterday and this morning, there is a fellow. Well, let me back up. When I was in Freed-Hardeman University, the church there, right there at campus, always had an associate minister, but the associate minister was a student. And especially our junior and senior year, or my junior and senior year at Freed-Hardeman, David Powell was the associate minister. And that's how I really got to know David. So David is not but maybe 3 years older than I am, 4. But David went on. David went on from there to go to Harding Grad. David has his PhD. David's a really good guy. For many years, David has taught at Freed-Hardeman. And for many years, he preached at the North Jackson congregation. He has since laid that responsibility off on someone else. And he's teaching, at the college, the university, with the idea of retiring fairly soon. When I went back to graduate school, here's a guy that I had known a lot of for a while. But when I went back to graduate school, guess who one of my teachers was? David. Now, do you call him David? Do you call him Dr. David? Do you call him Dr. Powell? Or hey, you, which is what I'd really like to call him. And like I say, David's a great, great guy. But one of the things that I had to do, and I didn't have a problem doing, was I had to respect David as my teacher in that class, that he was the authority for that class. And that, like I say, I didn't have a problem doing it at all. But that's what they're dealing with here. Do we have any respect for Paul? Paul says, I'm hoping that you would. Why? Because I've shared with you the gospel. And I would hope that you would welcome it with open arms and be delighted in the idea of what you're receiving. And you would also receive me as well. But evidently, that's not what has happened. To preach the gospel, he says in verse 16, in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's sphere of accomplishments. We're simply doing what God would want us to do. We have done, remember the passage, we have done that which is our duty to do. But he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. For not he who commends himself is approved, but who the Lord commends. If you glory, verse 17, make sure that it's in accordance to God. You've stayed within the sphere of God. You've stayed within the teachings of God. You're boasting of God's work, really, not yourself. Because he says, look at what he says in verse 18. It's not. He says, for not he who commends himself is approved. It's not who toots their own horn the loudest, which sometimes we sometimes say. It says it's who the Lord toots their horn. That's what's important. Paul is trying to put them in their place. He's Paul's defending himself. He's teaching a great principle. Where authority lies, and listen to that authority. Anything else? Well, it's a great chapter, and it people that shine your light through our life so that folks will see you and not us. We ask that you watch over us, bless us, and keep us. This is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great, great week. Thank y'all.